Today we're talking about seam lines. I hates them. I hates them so bad. Seam lines suck. But I got some quick, easy tips for you. Hey everybody, welcome back to Building Steam. I'm Brian Fadrosh of Brian Fadrosh Designs. Welcome back down to the shop. And today we're going to be talking about seam lines, the steps that you can take in your build process to reduce those seam lines that you seem to think everybody is going to notice. Now, the bad news is if you're new to EVA foam, you're always going to have seam lines. And the reason for that being is you're taking smaller sections of EVA foam and gluing them together to make a larger, more complex shape. The good news is there are a number of steps that you can take to either eliminate them entirely or reduce the distraction that they're causing. Now, in my experience, seam lines are something that you should be addressing and paying attention to throughout the build process. So I've kind of got this broken down into 3 specific areas. I'm going to talk about the steps that you can take in the pre-construction phase, and that means what you can do when you're just dealing with your patterns to ensure that you're getting nice, clean seam lines. We're going to talk about what you can do during the construction phase when you're actually cutting out foam. And last but not least, and the one that I tend to run into the most, is when you've done all of that and your seam lines aren't nearly as good as you seem to have thought that they were at the time. So believe it or not, there's a number of steps that you can take to ensure that you have really clean seam lines or no seam lines at all, just by manipulating the pattern that you're working with. Now, if you're just starting out in EVA foam, or even in some instances if you're established, you're going to be using a pattern that someone else has provided to you, or one that you've built yourself. Most of the time, those pattern pieces are only going to be for half of what you're making. So as an example, if you're working on a shoulder pauldron, that pattern piece is only going to be for half of the shoulder. You have to take that pattern piece, flip it upside down, and then do a second piece and then glue those together. In some instances, what you're able to do is, while you have those pattern pieces on paper, is start joining those together before you start putting them on your foam. That way, you're taking much smaller pieces and actually tracing out larger pieces. That's going to reduce the amount of seam lines you have to begin with. Now, in some instances, it's not going to work out exactly the way you want it to, and that shoulder pauldron is a great example of that. And that's simply because that center line for that shoulder pauldron is not going to be a straight line up and down. It's actually going to be a curve, because that's what gives you that bell shape. With that being the case, it's not going to work to just be able to line it up on a flat surface. So you're either going to have to tweak the size of it a little bit, or in some instances, figure something else that you can do to deal with that seam line. But any opportunity where you can take those individual pattern pieces and put them together even before you trace them out on foam automatically reduces the amount of seam lines that you have. Another step that you can take, and that you should be taking when you're working with pattern pieces, is use registration marks. Registration marks are going to be small lines that are perpendicular to the main outside line that you're using, that shows you exactly where that piece marries up to another piece. With that shoulder pauldron example, you're dealing with a curve. So it's not just going to go from edge to edge. It's going along that curve. Those registration marks that you're using will help you line up that seam as you go along it during the gluing phase to ensure you're getting it to go exactly where it's supposed to go. If you're doing that from the paper aspect of things, that will ensure that it's going to be as close as humanly possible for you. The third thing that you can do when you're dealing with your patterns is actually change where your seam lines show up. A great example of this would be working with a forearm piece that I have. Originally, the pattern piece that I had the seam line running down the front and back of my arm. But for the piece that I was making, I wanted it to be on the sides because I actually had a plan for using that seam line. As that's the case, what I did, took the entire pattern piece, made it all out of paper, taped it all together the way it was supposed to go to, and then redrew in where I wanted those seam lines to fall, recut it, and then traced out that manipulated pattern to ensure that those seam lines would show up where I wanted them to. So in the construction phase of things, there's 3 areas that you want to keep in mind to ensure that you're going to get nice clean seam lines. There's the cut, there's the glue up, and then there's the line up. As far as cutting goes, 2 important things you want to remember. 1, always use a sharp blade. The sharper your blade, the cleaner cut that you're making. Just as important is making sure that you're keeping the blade perpendicular to your cutting surface as you're cutting through that entire line. The reason for that being is that will give you a nice straight surface to apply the glue and then apply to the next piece. So you always want to make sure that as you're cutting, your blade isn't wandering to the left or right as you're cutting, unless you're doing a bevel cut and you're doing it on purpose. The second area that you want to keep in mind is the glue up. Everybody's usually going to be using contact cement as far as attaching 2 pieces of EVA foam together goes. As this is the case, you want to make sure you're letting that contact cement set up on both pieces completely before sticking them together. There is absolutely nothing worse than putting a whole entire piece together only to find out there's a 3-inch section in the middle that wasn't quite ready to go and your seam splits open after the fact. Last but not least is lining up the pieces. You always want to make sure that you're lining up the outside edge of those seams first, getting those to line up as flush as possible, and then attaching the rest of the seam together. Most people will either just do this by hand using their thumb as a guide to get it as smooth as possible along that seam, or some will take the pieces and put them flat on a surface like their work surface and then put them together. The important part that you want to remember is go slowly. Contact cement will grip quickly. As that's the case, go section by section slowly, ensuring the outside edge is lining up as smooth as possible. So now that you got everything put together, there's still a few other steps that you want to take to help either reduce or eliminate those seam lines. The first you'll want to do is you're going to want to sand down those seam lines and get them as flush as you possibly can. The one thing that I have come to notice and realize and learn myself is that when you're sanding it down, you want to make sure you're sanding it and contouring it to whatever shape that seam line is appearing on. So if you're doing it on a curved piece, you want to make sure you're sanding it in the direction of that curve. That gives you a much more consistent look as opposed to just a big flat straight line along that seam. Another issue that you're going to run into is you're going to need to fill in gaps that are along that seam. What a lot of people use for this is going to be quick seal. You add a very thin bead of quick seal along the seam line, then use a spatula or a wet finger to smooth it out, wait for it to dry, and then seal your foam. The issue that I run into with quick seal is I find that quick seal dries to a different texture than the surrounding foam, and therefore you're sanding a lot more and sealing a lot more to try to get that surface to look as consistent as possible. An alternative that I found that's worked out really well and I've had really great success with is using clay foam instead to go over those seam lines. The 2 important things to remember about clay foam is 1, you want to make sure that the surface that you're applying the clay foam to is wet. That will help it stick a lot more and stay on the actual piece. And secondly, you want to let it dry completely before sanding it down flush. However, you're using less material and it's a lot easier than having to completely seal the whole entire piece to give it a consistent look. But what if you've already sealed your foam and realize you have seam lines that are still showing? There are a couple steps that you can take to eliminate that and reduce those seam lines as well. This usually involves, however, having to refinish the whole entire surface of that single piece so your surface texture is all identical. What's worked out really well for me in the past is going over the whole entire piece in 3 or 4 extra coats of Plasti-Dip or 3 or 4 extra coats of Mod Podge and then sanding it down. Some other people have used Rapid Fill, which is a great product. In addition to that, some people have used fiberglass. The thing that you want to keep in mind to reduce those seam lines is you want the surface texture of the entire piece to be consistent. So even if you've already completely covered it in Plasti-Dip, you still have a way of reducing those seam lines completely. So one last quick tip as far as dealing with seam lines go. On my Warhammer build, I realized that I had a large number of long seam lines that were on the legs and on the arms that it was going to take me a lot longer to reseal, sand, fill, sand, refinish, reseal. So instead of trying to eliminate those seam lines, I decided to try to work with them. So I ended up coming up with the idea of just doing small hot glue rivets right along those seams. So it gave it the appearance that it was just plated metal that was riveted together. So instead of trying to take all that time to reduce them, I just made them work for me. So those are some tips, tricks, and techniques in dealing with seam lines in your builds. If there's a technique that I didn't talk about that's worked really well for you, leave me a comment down below. Would love to be able to see it. And try it out myself. The one thing that I do want to mention to everybody, regardless of what technique you use, regardless of how perfect you make that seam line, you're still going to know it's there because you're the one that made the build. You're the one that put it there. So you're always going to have a much more critical eye to that area than anybody else. So be gentle with yourself. You probably notice that seam line a lot more than anybody else does. If you guys are enjoying what we're doing here on the page, by all means, make sure you're hitting the like button. Make sure you're hitting the subscribe button. And as always, ladies and gentlemen, be kind to yourselves, but make, create, be inspired, and we'll catch you in the next video. So those are some tips, tricks, and techniques